I learned the sound of humiliation the night I thought I was becoming a wife. It wasn't a smack or a crash. It was the hush that fell when the wrong person seized a microphone and turned my name into a test. By then, my dress felt like borrowed armor and my smile like a hostage note. But that moment wasn't born on a dance floor. It began years earlier, in a small house where grief taught me to flinch at joy, and a single father taught me to stand up straight anyway. My name is Jenna, and I grew up on the quiet edge of Atlanta, in a ranch-style place that smelled like motor oil on Saturdays and pancakes on Sundays. When cancer took my mom, I was 8, and the world went out of focus, as if life had smudged a thumb across my lens. Dad, who ran a modest logistics company that crawled the interstates of the Southeast, became my compass. He showed up in all the ordinary ways that turn into extraordinary scaffolding for a, coffee before long hauls. Forgotten science projects resurrected at 9 p.m. Cracked knuckles flipping blueberry pancakes that were always slightly misshapen and always perfect. Loss made me cautious. I learned to be excellent instead of vulnerable, to ace the test and dodge the confession. Love, to me, looked like a doorway that might slam shut without warning. I was 29 when a coworker dragged me to a networking mixer where the bar lights made everyone look a little mythic and the small talk was loud enough to hide in. That's where I met Micah, 31, a software developer with a quick, earnest smile and the rare talent of asking about your life like he planned to remember the answer. He kept showing up a text after a rough meeting, a latte on my desk when my inbox swarmed, a walk through Piedmont Park where the city hummed its forgiving chorus. I said no to dinner until saying yes felt less like a risk and more like a relief. Burgers at the Varsity, laughing on my apartment balcony as the Midtown skyline blinked its patient Morse code. The kind of conversation that builds a bridge plank by plank. The night he dropped to one knee under the lights at Centennial Olympic Park. His hands shook just enough to feel honest. "Jenna," he said, "I want a life with you." I looked at the nervous steadiness in his eyes and believed that I could be brave out loud. Dad cried when I told him. His joy so unguarded it made me ache. "You're really doing this," he said, and I heard the years inside his voice, the scraped together tuition. The evenings he sat in the aluminum bleachers of my life and clapped until his hands hurt. I promised myself to trust the happiness, to stop waiting for the trap door. But even before I met Micah's family, doubt began to pace at the edge of the room like a cat tracing an invisible perimeter. The Caldwells lived in Buckhead, where hedges are trimmed like they expect an inspection, and porches come with columns that pretend they're holding up the sky. Micah called his parents traditional, which is one of those words that can mean many things, some of them sharp. The day we drove to Buckhead, my palms were slick and the bottle of wine in my lap felt like homework I wasn't sure would earn an A. Oakley opened the door, wearing pearls the way some people wear a crown to remind you that it's there. "Micah, darling," she trilled, and then she looked at me the way a jeweler looks at a stone they're not sure is worth setting. Victor glanced up from his phone, offered a hello that landed somewhere between courtesy and weather report, then returned to scrolling. The living room was immaculate in the way that makes you want to apologize for breathing. "So, Jenna," Oakley began, spine arrow straight. "We need to know you're suitable." The word lodged like a button in my throat. I told her about my work in marketing, about loving this city, about the father who raised me alone. Her mouth softened into something that wasn't kindness. "No mother to teach you how to be a proper wife," she observed, as if reading the label on a flawed appliance. Victor adjusted his glasses and added, Marrying into our family comes with responsibility. His tone made responsibility sound like a deed I could default on. I said I loved Micah, that we would build a life together. Oakley gave a delicate laugh that somehow echoed, "Support each other. A wife's primary role is to elevate her husband." When Micah's sister, Reagan, arrived, sharp suit, sharper smile. She spoke the word that told me exactly what they worshipped. Optics, she said. A single-parent background doesn't project stability. I waited for Micah to correct the record, to put his hand on the small of my back and call me his equal. He squeezed my fingers beneath the coffee table and kept his eyes on the rug. On the ride home through neighborhoods where the houses shrank back into the honest dark, he said, "They're particular. They'll come around." It sounded like a hope offered as strategy. I stared out at the city lights smearing themselves into commas and felt the first period drop at the end of my certainty. I told him I needed him to have my back. He said he would. The way people say we should get lunch sometime meaningful until it isn't. Wedding planning arrived like weather you can't reschedule. We chose a historic venue in Midtown with chandeliers that held their breath and floors that remembered other couples' footsteps. Weekends were a choreography of cake tastings and linen swatches. Dad learned the schedule and showed up with sandwiches and the kind of jokes that make you roll your eyes even as you memorize them because they are proof someone knows how to find you when you're lost. Micah stayed sweet in the daily ways, dancing me through the kitchen at 9 p.m. To a country song that rhymed heart with part as if that hadn't been done 1,000 times before. But whenever I tried to open the door to that afternoon in Buckhead, he eased it shut with a practiced gentleness. "They're old school," he'd say. "Once we're married, they'll see you." I wanted that to be a promise and not a postponement. I told myself that nerves often dress like warnings and that I was simply jittery because forever looks big up close. But sometimes your body knows before your mind signs the papers. As the date approached, I woke before my alarm and lay there counting breaths, rehearsing grace, mapping escape routes I swore I wouldn't need. I loved Micah. I wanted to stand beside him and say vows as if speaking them might build a house around us. I also wanted to stop bracing for impact. On the morning, I buttoned my dress, and Dad straightened my veil with hands that had greased axles and folded laundry, and held me through stomach flu and algebra. I chose to believe in the best version of the day. The room smelled like peach blossoms and new beginnings. I carried both like a bouquet that might weigh more than it bloomed. The ceremony itself felt like stepping into a dream stitched together from hope and borrowed time. The chandeliers glowed, casting gold light on polished hardwood, and the air held the faint sweetness of peach blossoms woven into the centerpieces. As Dad walked me down the aisle, his hand steady on mine, I caught Micah's eyes at the altar. He smiled, broad and almost boyish, like he couldn't believe I was real. For a fleeting moment, my chest loosened. We exchanged vows, his steady, mine trembling but clear. The applause that followed wrapped me in warmth. Cameras flashed, friends cheered, and for the span of a few heartbeats, I let myself believe the story I had been writing in my head, that love conquers fear, that family can be chosen, that joy can stay. At the reception, laughter and music swirled through the historic hall. I danced with Micah, spinning under the lights while the guests clapped in rhythm. My college friends cracked jokes at the bar. Dad told stories that made coworkers chuckle, and for the first time in weeks, I felt lighter. Maybe Oakley and Victor would keep to themselves. Maybe the nightmare of that Buckhead afternoon was fading into a lesson instead of a prophecy. I pressed my cheek against Micah's shoulder and whispered, Maybe this will work. He kissed the top of my head, and for an instant, I believed him. But shadows don't disappear because you ignore them. They wait, patient and calculating. Near the bar, Oakley and Victor leaned together, their cheeks flushed, glasses in hand. I told myself not to stare, not to worry. Yet when the MC passed me the microphone to thank our guests, Oakley's hand shot out. She snatched it from me, her pearls swinging as she swayed, her voice slurred but sharp enough to pierce the music. "Listen up, Jenna," she declared, wobbling on her heels. "You're part of our family now, so you better step up. We expect you to hand over your salary $8,500 a month straight to us. Prove you're not just some gold digger." The hall froze. Laughter sputtered into silence. I stood there, bouquet clutched like a shield, the microphone dangling in her hand like a gavel about to fall. Whispered shock rippled across the tables. Some guests looked horrified, others half smirked as if waiting for the punchline. My cheeks burned. My eyes darted to Micah, begging him silently to stop her, to speak, to show me the man I thought I'd married. He stared at the floor, his lips pressed into a pale, bloodless line. The silence screamed louder than Oakley's words. Victor lurched forward, tugging the microphone from his wife, his tone mocking as he sneered. "That dress doesn't suit you. You should have asked us first." Oakley nodded, drunk satisfaction gleaming in her eyes. "Tell her, Victor," she urged. "She needs to know her place." A few guests gasped. Others shifted uncomfortably, phones already tilted upward, recording. Something inside me cracked. My body trembled, but my mind sharpened with humiliation so fierce it turned hot into steel. Dad stepped forward, calm but fierce, his eyes burning with the fire I'd seen only when life backed him into corners. He took the microphone with deliberate care, his voice steady but ringing through the room. "That's enough," he said. "You're embarrassing yourselves, and worse, you're humiliating my daughter." "Have you no shame?" gasps erupted, and whispers curled like smoke. Oakley glared, unsteady but defiant. "Who are you to talk a single father with no class, raising a girl who doesn't belong in our world?" My chest clenched, the sting of old wounds reopening in public, but Dad didn't flinch. He leaned closer, his words lower but lethal. "Funny you should say that. Oakley, Victor, your boss, Tom Grayson, was raised by his mother alone, a single parent. You just insulted him, and I'm sure he'll enjoy hearing about it." The color drained from Victor's face. Oakley's smirk collapsed into panic. Around us, the crowd stirred, some guests whispering louder, some outright chuckling, others filming every second with phones held high. The Caldwells, who had spent their lives curating their image, now stood exposed under a harsher light than any chandelier could provide. I should have felt triumphant, vindicated by Dad's courage. And part of me did. His loyalty, his unwavering defense, filled me with pride. But the ache was louder, because while my father had stepped up without hesitation, Micah had stayed silent. He hadn't even tried. His hands shoved in his pockets, his eyes glued to the floor. He looked less like a husband and more like a bystander. The truth slammed into me harder than Oakley's insults. Micah would never stand up for me. Not against his parents. Maybe not against anything. My breath caught, and something in me shifted. The humiliation burned, but underneath it sparked a clarity I hadn't expected. I walked forward, took the microphone back from my father, and lifted my chin. "Thank you all for coming," I said, my voice trembling at first but gaining strength as it echoed through the hall. But there won't be a marriage today. I deserve better than this. My gaze swept over the stunned crowd, then landed on Micah. His face had gone pale, but he still said nothing. I turned to Oakley and Victor, my chest heaving. And you'll never control me. Gasps broke into applause, some hesitant, some fierce, and in that clamor I felt the ground under my feet steady. I handed the microphone back to the MC, gripped my father's hand, and walked out of the hall. The skirt of my dress trailed behind me like a ghost of the life I had almost stepped into. Outside, the cool Atlanta night wrapped around me, cleansing and brutal. My father pulled me into his arms. "I'm so proud of you, Jenna," he whispered, his voice thick with pride and grief. Tears slid hot down my cheeks, not just for the dream that had collapsed, but for the strength I had discovered standing in the rubble. The night air hit me like a baptism, cool and bracing as I stepped onto the sidewalk in my wedding dress, hand still locked in Dad's. The streetlights glowed against the Atlanta skyline, and I felt the weight of dozens of eyes still on my back through the tall windows of the reception hall. Cars honked somewhere down Peachtree, the city moving on as if my world hadn't just unraveled. Dad opened the car door for me, his movements gentle, protective, like I was still his little girl with scraped knees. I slid into the seat, the silk of my dress bunching awkwardly around me, and for the first time in months, I exhaled without pretending. The drive home was silent, punctuated only by the hum of the engine and the occasional swipe of Dad's thumb across the steering wheel, a nervous tick he tried to hide. I stared out the window, watching neon signs smear into colorless streaks. My chest ached, but underneath the pain was something steadier relief. Better to be humiliated once than to live a lifetime in chains. Still, as the city blurred past, the betrayal gnawed at me. Not just from Oakley and Victor, but from Micah, the man who had sworn forever, who had promised to have my back and had chosen silence instead. At home, I peeled off the dress, hung it on the back of my closet door like a monument to a war I never chose. I showered until the hot water turned lukewarm, scrubbing off the perfume, the sweat, the weight of a name I would never take. When I emerged, Dad was on the porch, 2 mugs of coffee steaming in the cool night. He didn't speak, didn't lecture. He just handed me a mug, his eyes meeting mine with quiet pride. I sat beside him, the wood creaking beneath us, and for the first time since Micah proposed, I felt safe. The next days passed in a blur of logistics I had never imagined handling. I called the venue, the caterers, the florist, apologizing and explaining with a voice steadier than my heart. I returned gifts, refunded deposits where I could, and sent notes to every guest, thanking them for their time and their presence. I expected judgment, whispers behind my back about the runaway bride. Instead, support poured in. Friends texted late at night, reminding me I'd dodged a bullet. Coworkers brought casseroles and wine, leaving notes that said, "Proud of you." My phone buzzed with messages I never expected. Kindness layered over my raw edges. But the world didn't stop talking. The story traveled faster than any of us could have imagined. Guests had filmed Oakley and Victor's drunken tirade, clips going viral within hours. One showed Oakley demanding my salary, her words slurred but sharp. Another captured Dad calling them out, the crowd's gasp loud enough to echo across the internet. By morning, co-workers of Micah were sharing the video in their office group chats, mocking his family's arrogance, his silence. Within a week, word spread that Micah had resigned from his job, unable to face the shadow of his parents' humiliation and his own. Victor's downfall came harder. True to his word, Dad told Tom Grayson, Victor's boss and longtime friend, about the insults aimed at single parents. Tom, who had been raised by his mother alone, didn't take kindly to the slight within days. Victor was reassigned to a dead-end role in a rural office outside Monroe. The man who had once sneered at me from his leather chair in Buckhead was suddenly stripped of the status he worshipped. Oakley, too, felt the sting. Her friends at the country club, once eager to orbit her pearls and sharp tongue, turned their backs. Reagan, who had lectured me about optics, found herself on the wrong end of them. Their social circle closed like a gate, leaving them outside in the cold. I should have felt vindicated, and part of me did, but mostly I felt free. I no longer carried the weight of trying to fit into their world. I had my own, a world built on the porch with Dad, on Sunday barbecues, on years of quiet sacrifices and unshakable love. I leaned into it, finding comfort in the ordinary. One evening, a week after the wedding that wasn't, Dad and I sat in the backyard, smoke curling from the grill, cicadas humming in the Georgia dusk. He looked at me, eyes steady. "Jenna," he said, "you're stronger than you know, and I could use you at the company, maybe even running the show one day." My chest tightened. The logistics company wasn't glamorous, but it was his life's work. The empire he had carved out mile by mile on the interstates. The idea of joining him, of carrying his legacy forward, felt like a lifeline. "I'll do it," I said, my voice firm. "I want to make you proud." His smile was quiet, but it reached his eyes. "You already do, kid." In that moment, I realized the wedding hadn't been an ending. It was the beginning of something bigger, a reclamation. I wasn't just walking away from Micah and his family. I was walking toward myself. The weeks that followed were a strange blend of endings and beginnings. My phone buzzed with sympathy, gossip, and curiosity. Yet inside, I felt calmer than I had in months. I threw myself into learning Dad's logistics business. The office smelled of diesel and paper contracts, the hum of truck dispatches and printers filling the space like a heartbeat. At first, I shadowed him, watching how he negotiated with clients, how he treated every driver like family, how he never cut corners even when it cost him. He had built this company from sweat and grit, and I realized I wanted to be part of that story, not just as his daughter, but as someone capable of carrying it forward. It wasn't easy. I made mistakes, messed up routing, forgot to follow up on invoices, fumbled with industry jargon, but Dad never scolded. He let me stumble, then showed me how to stand. Slowly, the drivers began to trust me. The clients started to call me directly, and with each small victory, I felt myself rebuild. Where once I had defined myself by Micah's love, I now measured my worth in miles delivered, deals secured, late nights where I held my ground in negotiations. Meanwhile, the Caldwell name soured in Atlanta society. Victor's demotion spread through Buckhead like a cautionary tale. Oakley was no longer welcome at luncheons where she once reigned, and Reagan's smugness faded under the weight of whispers. Videos of their drunken tirade lived online, circulating in corners of the internet they could never scrub clean. For them, image had been everything, and now it was shattered beyond repair. I didn't celebrate their downfall aloud, but inside, I acknowledged the symmetry. They had tried to humiliate me publicly, and in the end, they destroyed themselves with the same weapons. Micah reached out once. A message, short and clumsy, landing in my inbox like a ghost. I'm sorry. I didn't know how to handle them. I should have spoken up. Can we talk? I stared at it for a long time, my heart tugging against my new armor. I remembered his smile, the way he had once made me feel safe. But then I remembered his silence, his refusal to stand beside me when it mattered most. Love without loyalty is a house without walls. I deleted the message without replying. Dad noticed the quiet resolve in me and gave me more responsibility at the company. One afternoon, after I closed a contract that secured 6 new routes, he leaned back in his chair, pride shining in his tired eyes. "You're a natural," he said. "This business, it's not just about trucks or freight. It's about trust. And you've got it." I blinked back tears, realizing I wasn't just stepping into his legacy. I was building my own. At night, I'd sit on the porch with him, the same porch where Mom's laughter once echoed, where I had once watched the stars as a little girl. We'd talk about the future, about expansion, about maybe buying a second office. Sometimes, though, we didn't talk at all. We'd sit in companionable silence, cicadas singing in the dark, knowing that after everything, we still had each other. Looking back, the wedding wasn't the tragedy I once thought it was. It was a gift in disguise. It tore away the illusions I had clung to and forced me to see my own strength. Micah's silence was painful, yes, but it freed me from a life where I would have always been second to his parents. Oakley and Victor's cruelty was searing, but it reminded me of the worth my father had instilled in me, the worth no one could take away. I began to understand that sometimes what feels like the end of the world is just the universe clearing the stage for a better act. Heartbreak became fuel, betrayal became clarity, and humiliation became the spark that lit a fire inside me I hadn't known was there. One evening, sitting with Dad as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of peach and gold, I realized the lesson life had carved into me. You don't need anyone's approval to be enough. Not a man's, not his family's, not society's. Worth isn't handed to you. It's built, mile by mile, word by word, choice by choice. So here I am, standing taller, not as someone's almost wife, but as a woman with her own path, her own fire, her own story. I'm still learning, still stumbling, but I'm moving forward with purpose. The wedding that fell apart didn't ruin me. It set me free. And for that, I will always be grateful. If my story touched you, if you found a piece of your own strength in it, I invite you to like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment with your thoughts. I'd love to hear how you faced your own storms and what you've learned from them. Life may be messy, but it's ours to shape. And sometimes the worst day turns into the first step toward the best chapter.